Paul Johnson with New Frontiers, and I'm here with my co-author of our book, What's Right with America, Larry Aldrich. Larry, thanks for being with us today.
Well, I'm glad to be here and welcome everybody watching us or listening to us.
All right, now, Larry and I have been taking a lot of grief lately for having even a title that would be named What's Right with America, because everybody seems to think that there's a lot wrong going on with America today. We're going to talk a little bit about that. We're going to talk about a couple of the big challenges. We're going to focus on the budget, as well as the issues that we're having with trade imbalances, some of the economic issues that we've been facing. But we're going to try to frame that in the context of our book, which is to talk about what were our founders actually intending? What was the goal? What were they trying to get to? And did they have some misses here? So, Larry, let's start with the book again, if we can. Give just a short introduction to what we were trying to do.
I think we were trying to, and I think we succeeded in identifying, the fact that America was designed by our founders. Mm-hmm. The founders of America were very, very bright people who worked very hard, and they compromised quite often. Even though they didn't agree with each other, they worked very hard to come up with a common understanding to create what became America. And they were building on a foundation of a broken system, the Articles of Confederation, which didn't work very well. So they knew they had to fix something. But I think a big part of our book is we say this was a design system, and most importantly, they designed it around the power of individuals, and for individuals to believe what they believe, say what they want to say, work as hard as they want to work, get educated, pretty much do everything as long as they don't interfere with the rights of other people. That is kind of novel in the world, or it was novel back when the country was founded, and that was the basis for What's Right with America.
And so, let's try to put this in context, because as you said, our theme or our thesis is based around the individual. And we have a fundamental belief that while there are a lot of books and theories out there today about what has made America as great as it is, one thing that we tend to agree with, if you just look at the data, is there's nothing like the United States today in the world. Just quite simply, this is the greatest superpower ever in the history of the planet. But the issue is, oftentimes the complaints that we have, they're comparing us to vapor, as opposed to comparing us to 40 years ago or 50 years ago, where there's no doubt the data would show that we've dramatically improved, or comparing us to other nations around the world. Either way, the differential is huge.
The differential is huge, and we can see it just in terms of our economy and the data that supports what our gross domestic product per person is compared with what it is in Europe. Dramatically higher, and been dramatically growing over the last 20 to 40 years. So the gap is widening. I'll use a stat that I've heard you use quite frequently, which is if you look at Mississippi, which is our lowest GDP per person state, Mississippi has a GDP per person greater than most every place in Europe. And it's kind of shocking to people. And yet people complain that America is basically giving up all of our resources to other countries. And the data would suggest the opposite of that approach.
Okay, so in the news today is a big issue, which is the House resolution bill, where they're focused on the budget. So what I want to do is I want to spend a little bit of time today thinking about, did the founders have some misses? Did they have some things that maybe they should have thought through? And one of them is, should we have had a balanced budget? Before we get to that, maybe what we should do is just spend a moment thinking about what the founders actually were trying to do with the balance of power.
I think the balance of power is key. They clearly articulated in writing in many places, but especially the Federalist Papers, that people can't be trusted. Power does corrupt. Mm-hmm. And so they built the foundation of America around the separation of powers. Article 1, the most important article, provides the power of Congress. And even in Congress, they separated the power between what they viewed as the closest to democracy, the House of Representatives, fewer than 435 back then, but they were elected by people in their district. And so they represented their district. Whereas senators were elected by state. And so they divided the powers between the House and the Senate. So if laws were to be passed, both the House and the Senate had to pass those laws, and then the president had to sign that law. And if the president didn't like the law, he could veto the law, and the House and Senate could come back and override the veto if they chose. So I think they were looking for ways to create collaboration. The separation almost demands that people work together. And I think it's part of the challenge we have today. There's a sense that I can't compromise with you if I disagree with you, which is just simply not the way life works. It doesn't work in our families that way. It doesn't work in our faith that way. It doesn't work in our communities. It doesn't work in the country when we basically say my way or the highway. And the founders created that framework to enable us to basically reach a general consensus, more than 50% plus one vote, on issues of importance. And I think the challenge we are having over maybe the last 3, 4, 5 presidencies is power by executive order, which doesn't put anything into law, and then the next president comes in and doesn't like it, and they overturn those executive orders, where the founders expected that there to be legislation passed in a bipartisan way, agreeing by the House and the Senate, also agreeing by the president. And we've kind of missed that point today. So we have some work to do to get back to that. But I think that's what they were trying to do, recognizing that power can corrupt. Let's separate those powers, but let's also then expect that separation to be basically put back together through agreement and compromise. And that agreement and compromise are words we need today.
Yeah. So let's think about that in terms of the budget. So, I mean, my own personal view of the budget, and I think many economists share this view today. We've gotten to the point with our budget deficits that they're so large that they could be possibly catastrophic to the United States, that we could create a position for ourselves where maybe we can no longer continue to have the dollar as strong as it's been. Maybe we're going to have a problem selling our bonds. In fact, I think we just had a $16 billion sale, which is a pretty small sale, where Treasury Secretary Bassett had some difficulty in being able to sell those bonds. The current budget that's been proposed by the House of Representatives adds anywhere between $3.5 to $5 trillion to the budget over a 10-year period of time. Now, I find that to be interesting because we're really talking about $86 or $87 trillion over a 10-year period of time, and they're struggling to find an ability to cut two.
Yeah.
Right? That's really what they're struggling with. The issue with the budget is, the way I see it, we have a House of Representatives, the Republicans, who have proposed a budget that is completely out of whack. And the only thing that the Democrats are really doing in response to that is talking about where they've cut out more than they should have, as opposed to talking about the issue of how do we get closer to balance. Ray Dalio has just written his new book. I really recommend it, but it talks about how countries go bankrupt. And in his book, he points out that before COVID, we were running about 3% deficits. If you took our deficits on an annualized basis, it was about 3% of GDP. We've increased those deficits now to where they're 6 or 7%. And the point that he makes is that that's not sustainable. We get into to interest rates that begin to eat us up in a 10-year period of time. In fact, one of the interesting factors with this current budget is that the existing budget, where we have $3 to $5 trillion worth of where we have $3 to $5 trillion worth of deficits that are added over a 10-year period of time, that's based upon a 3.5% interest rate. Everything that we're seeing says it may actually exceed 5 or 6, and that begins to have a dramatic effect on it. Bill Clinton, I remember back when he's the last president to have a balanced budget, but you may remember he put up those placards behind him where he talked about, all right, here's how the budget affects long-term interest rates. And if you don't get closer to balancing the budget, then these interest rates begin to go up. And that becomes a tax on you in itself. He sold the country on why a balanced budget needed to happen. And he balanced it. He was able to get that done. Here's my question. Why do you think the founders left that out? What were they thinking not to do it? And maybe part of that answer is we're only at the first part of this process.
A good question. I think there are some very important issues which we reflect in our book. The founders did choose to leave out. I suspect they left it out because they didn't think it was going to be a problem.
Mhm.
They just they probably at that time expected that you basically you get revenue coming in and you have expenses going out, and they balance just normal. You might run a deficit, and the country did run a deficit during the Revolutionary War and had to use tariffs, which was actually their first area of federal revenue to come in to solve some of those problems. My guess is and I have not seen anything in the research I've done to indicate why I don't think they even thought about that. And they were making compromises. They didn't want to tackle things that they didn't want to tackle. And, our book has been a great book, and Paul and I working together, but we didn't agree on everything.
Mhm.
And I normally don't agree that the federal government should have a balanced budget. I think I think every state now has a balanced budget requirement. But the federal government has to be there in times of turmoil, in a recession or a depression or a war or COVID or some natural issues that are very big. It would be impossible for the country to run if everybody had to keep their money in balance. You would not be, people would be on the streets starving. So I think conceptually, the idea of a balanced budget makes sense, but also conceptually, it doesn't make sense. However, when you basically continue to spend your children's money, your grandchildren, your great-grandchildren's money, that's a problem. I mean, I do see the Republicans, not many, but quite a few Republicans in the Senate now saying, this dog don't hunt. We must get this in balance. I heard Senator Ron Johnson of Wisconsin on a podcast the other day basically saying, if you just look at 2019 spending, and then we had COVID, and the spending went through the roof for obvious reasons and for good reasons. But he goes, why is it we can't get back to 2019 spending? And he's not talking about getting back to the absolute number. He said, let's take 2019 spending, which was pre-COVID, when things were going pretty well, and then adjust it for a growth of our population, and then adjust it for the growth of inflation. Inflation is up, give or take 20% in 2 years since 19, maybe a little bit more. So he's not saying go back to 19. He's saying make those adjustments. And that number is about $800 billion less than what the House passed. So he says he's a hard no unless those numbers come down. Senator Rand Paul from Tennessee he's always said he's a hard no because we spend too much money. I did see this morning that Elon Musk is now opposing the bill, saying all the stuff that Doge was trying to do, and he claimed that they could find $1 trillion in savings, and others in the Trump administration claimed they could find $1 trillion in revenue. And that $2 trillion would get us pretty close to what Ray Dalio has said we should do. In fact, it would get us to where he needs us to be. So I think, Elon Musk's going, I did all this work. I did it for free. I created a whole lot of drama, and we're spending more money. So I think there's a significant amount of pressure. Now, President Trump has been amazing in how he corrals people who say, I'm never going to vote for something. And he corrals them pretty well. We'll see if he does that in the Senate. But I do think the Senate realizes this is their opportunity. If Republicans have united control of the government and they say we cannot deficit spend this way anymore, how in the world can they do that with this budget? And the Speaker of the House, Speaker Johnson, says, well, it's hard to turn around this aircraft carrier in a mile or two. It takes a little while, so we're turning it. We'll turn it further down the road. But there are choices that can be made, and they will have significant impacts on people. And we have to recognize that. Everybody wants more stuff. I call it the Santa Claus effect. We want more stuff paid for by Santa Claus. I want more benefits from the federal government that you pay for. I don't want to pay for it. You want me to pay for it? No. Charge those rich people or charge those other people. Charge those workers. Don't charge me, but I want the free stuff. And that's just human nature. So you would hope that leadership in the Senate, you would have hoped that leadership in the House would say, we have a chance here to turn this aircraft around, and maybe a little quicker. Maybe we throw the parachutes in the water and do whatever we need to get it done within a mile or two rather than 10 miles.
Yeah, a couple of points that are interesting to me on that. You mentioned Elon Musk. I can't imagine that he's not incredibly disappointed with where they are. He was able to cut about $150 billion, which was dramatically less than the trillion that he said. But the first step for Congress in that is the rescission, right? Taking those items that he was able to cut and putting them into law. They refused to do the rescission. So that means almost all those items are back in. They're back into the budget. And then second, if you look at the budget in terms of what they've added back in, it's dramatically higher than anything he was able to cut out. It takes what he did and made it basically worthless. Now, whether you like Elon Musk or not, he put a lot of risk for what he was doing. I mean, he certainly hurt his car company. He certainly hurt car sales. He's hurt himself financially. He put out a lot of money in it. My guess is the reason that he's pulling back right now is an extreme sense of disappointment. I think you may be right. The Senate, you made mention of the Senate may change that. That's kind of as the founders intended. I think the founders intended that the House would work more on a basis of what was popular, and they have a very difficult time doing anything that's unpopular. Well, what's popular? Cutting taxes are popular. Well, what else is popular? Not cutting programs. In fact, increasing programs. They're increasing programs across the board, and everything from illegal immigration to how it is that they're dealing with the Defense Department. Again, those are popular. But the Senate is elected on 6-year terms by design to try to give them more time to be more deliberative, to try to think about the problem in a much longer term way. And hopefully that begins to work. But the other thing that I find to be interesting in this is that we did obviously go through some research where we found that the founders did talk about this. And that namely was Hamilton. When Hamilton made the decision, he went out and he basically cut a deal with the people who own debt inside each of the states, that the federal government would take that debt over. Now, of course, that made each of the states happy about the concept that the debt that they were worried about being paid on may not be paid, and now the federal government was going to take it over. And that was from the Revolutionary War. In the meantime, what that did is it took a number of the senators who were looking at actually saying, why should we pay this debt? In some cases, speculators have bought it at 10 cents on the dollar. Why should we be the ones responsible for carrying the payment of that debt? And what Hamilton knew was that if the United States stands good on its debt obligations, it will be able to borrow more in the future. Imagine World War II if we couldn't have borrowed. Imagine what would have happened. And just as you said, a balanced budget amendment or a balanced budget is probably important during good years, but during bad years, it may be important that you not comply with deficit spending beyond a balanced budget, especially in something where you're looking at World War II or the Depression or great catastrophes that have happened where we needed to infuse more money back into it. But the good faith and credit of the United States is an important factor, and they did understand that from the beginning. They did understand. They may not have put it into the Constitution, but they certainly understood the concept.
Yeah. I think it's important if there are viewers or listeners who are constituents of Senator Johnson in Wisconsin, provide him with the backbone that he's going to need to follow through on what he said. I mean, recent history would suggest what will likely happen here is they will back off their cuts and they won't back off their revenue reduction. So you're going to get a worse bill coming out of the Senate, not a better bill. I hope that's not the case, but the cynicism is enough that based on experience that would happen. I think part of the challenge, and I wish it was in President Trump's makeup to go to do a fireside chat for all Americans, not just a rally, and say to the American people, here are the problems we're facing. Here's what happens if we don't get our debt in check. And maybe he brings in Ray Dalio to give a little bit overview from his perspective. Here's how it's going to impact your kids and your grandkids. It may impact you. Here's where borrowing costs start to go up. Here's why it's so expensive to buy a home. We have to come together and figure this out, which means we've got to increase some revenue and we've got to reduce some expenses. And not just the expenses I hate, collectively expenses.
Mhm.
And, and say, okay, well, food stamps, for example, and I will have the numbers wrong, but it was something like we were spending $50 billion on food stamps in 19. That number grew to like 120 billion. And the House bill is back to 90. Now, Senator Johnson would say, well, good, it shouldn't go back to 50, adjusted for population, people on food stamps, adjusted for inflation. Maybe that number is 60 or 65. They're still at 90. And, but the problem is you have real people relying on that food. So what is the plan to say, let's take some of those funds out in this budget, and then next year we're going to take some more money out, and we're going to get back there. We give people a chance to figure it out over the next 3 years. All of these expenses, they want to cut the Department of Education. I actually believe that makes sense. I'm sure the teachers watching this are going to be unhappy. It makes no sense for the federal government just to pile money into teachers or pile money into police or pile money into sheriff. In my opinion, it makes more sense for the state or local to deal with that. But since I think in Arizona, the teachers' salaries are supported by 15% by federal government, if you're going to cut that out, you've got to give the state of Arizona a chance to figure it out. Are we going to reallocate how we spend? Are we going to charge more in taxes? Are we going to help the local communities charge more in property taxes so that teachers don't take a pay cut because of the federal government's decision? But that would require some planning. And at the moment, I don't see a whole lot of planning coming out of Washington. I mean, maybe they're incapable these days of doing that, but we should expect better. We should expect people that go to that Congress are thinking about the long-term benefit of people. And as Ray Dalio says, if we don't do that, here's what it's going to do to interest rates, and here's why that's going to be meaningfully bad for you.
Yeah, from my standpoint, I want to see them get to being within the 3% range, and if they do that with cuts, that's fine. They'll have to deal with that at the election. That's what elections are for, and maybe they do get beat from it. I happen to think a balanced approach is better. I think that's what Clinton did. We had some tax increases. In fact, he took us to the 39%. Trump took us back down to 37 at the highest income level. But there were also some cuts in it. We may remember Clinton made the speech about the end of big government is over, and he started talking about changes that they could do into the welfare system. The point I would give is that you do have to sell it, and you have to convince the public. The reason that I would be supportive of my income tax going up from the 37 to 39 is because I'm convinced if they don't get close to balancing this budget, my interest rates are going to go from 5 to 7 or 5
or
to
your
9.
Inflation or your cost of buying anything will go up.
That's right.
So it's both the interest rates, inflation, everything. We're all impacted by these decisions. To think this is a political battle only in Washington is nonsense. And so everybody who is involved in this country are Americans, and in some cases people here aren't American citizens, but they're here and they're working here, need to get engaged in this, need to understand how important it is that Congress get this right, and that the president get this right.
And the greatest tax on the middle class is higher interest rates. I mean, the single biggest asset that most people own in the middle class is a home. And if they can either buy a home or refinance a home down at 3% as opposed to 5%, that is a huge difference to them in terms of what their annual income is. And there is a direct connection between those interest rates and how much money the federal government borrows. The amount of money that they borrow continues to take money out of the pool, and it creates more competition for the dollars that are left over. And that's what partly causes the rising interest rates. If you do the budget that's been presented by the House, the one thing I'm sure of is 10-year interest rates aren't going down. And in fact, Trump, who's been pushing the Federal Reserve Chairman to lower interest rates, I think he's going to end up with the exact opposite. I think he's going to have, at least under this chairman, a rise of interest rates because he's going to recognize that it's highly inflationary.
Yeah, and I think that it was such a mistake, in my opinion. I don't spend a whole lot of time dealing with interest rates and futures and all that. But back when interest rates were up, when the federal rate was a quarter, between 0 and 1/4%. I think the 30-year might have dipped down in the low ones, mid ones. The opportunity back then would have been, most we sell, we put out in terms of bonds and treasury bills is 30 years. why didn't we do something at 50 years
Mhm.
or 100 years? The question is whether the market would buy it. But when interest rates were so low, could you have taken the deficit of America? Could you have taken that was not even recognized, but everybody knows it, the $70 trillion deficit in Social Security, Medicare, Medicaid, and basically monetize this with a higher rate, just kind of solve the problem? That would have been an interesting conversation back when interest rates were, give or take,
But we had a
1% or
negative
lower.
interest rate for a very short period of time.
Yeah, and so we can't do it today, but the point is the flexibility was there to have done that. Well, when you have interest rates, when the 30-year rate is over 5%, you can't sell a 50 or 100-year bond in America today. It just wouldn't make any sense. It would be too expensive. Why would you want to give money even to somebody willing to do it for 50 years at 4%? You'd be nuts.
Mm-hmm.
But we've missed that opportunity, and we need to get those opportunities back. Financial engineers can do this pretty well, because we're going to have to solve this problem. One of the positive sides of what we're dealing with is the fact that America is a very wealthy country in terms of the assets we own. The federal government owns, I think the numbers are somewhere like $300 trillion, some giant number. I mean, it depends on how you calculate it. We have land, we have equipment, we have buildings. You go down the list.
Natural resources.
Natural
oil.
resources. We have some of the Trump administration talking about the continental shelves and allowing mining on the continental shelves, which are natural resources. There's, I think where people are not terribly worried about a $37 trillion deficit is we could basically monetize that by using some of the assets or selling some of the assets we have. But, we can't just talk about it. We have to solve the problem. It would be much better for us just to live within our means.
Mm-hmm.
And I would love to see us live within a balanced budget in good times and maybe 3% in bad times, but certainly no more than averaging 3%, as Ray Dalio talks about. And any family would do that.
Mm-hmm.
Any state has to do that. I mean, the state of Arizona had to sell government buildings to stay within their requirements and during the Great Recession. They made some tough choices, but they made those tough choices because that is the law. And in Congress, it's really simple for them to decide to spend more money. They're not spending their money. They're spending our money.
Mm-hmm.
And they're not spending it wisely. We do have needs. There are certainly pressing needs in America. There's certainly, we look at what's happening with airports and airplanes, and the FAA is incredibly old technology because they've been pushing that off. We got to spend that money. So we got to probably, you and I both believe we've got to spend money on defense.
Mm-hmm.
We need, we're in a scary world, and we need to spend more money on defense. And it's probably another 100 billion, 200 billion, who knows the number, a big number to basically modernize our various military equipment. If the president can pull off his Star Wars approach, that's another 150 to $300 billion.
We know that we need to upgrade all of our nuclear arsenal.
We do.
And it's funny because the first time Bob Robb mentioned that on our program, it was like, oh my gosh, why would we update our nuclear arsenal? But one of the senators from Arizona, who after he retired went onto a committee, and you start looking at our nuclear arsenal, it's in huge disarray. There are massive problems with it. And the question to that, maybe we could talk about that for a moment, is it shouldn't be lost on the American public that we avoided a nuclear war over the last 50 years. And that may seem like, it's just too impossible to happen. The answer to that is it almost did happen a number of times.
Well, and I think that's a lot of what we have in our book is talking about the things that we just take for granted. That we for the most part have taken the rule of law for granted, the ability to buy things at the store or buy a home and not worry about it. We have kind of taken for granted that we didn't have nuclear annihilation. We kind of take for granted that we're not going to have nuclear annihilation, but that requires work and thought and education. We do cite in the book a pretty good stat that gives me more optimism than what Bob Robb has said, is that I think the numbers over the last 3 years, the United States has spent more than half the money modernizing that is spent on modernizing nuclear forces around the world. They probably don't pick up all the China spend because China doesn't have that many nuclear weapons. But we have spent a large amount of money, and we need to spend more money on that. So, yeah, by getting our deficits down, we then collectively have a greater opportunity to look at where should we spend additional money in the future that benefits Americans, protects Americans, protects the border, protects our military, make sure we don't have nuclear annihilation. And right now we're deer in the headlights because everything is so expensive and looking like it's getting worse, not better.
I had an old guy say to me, I thought it was interesting. He said, well,
I am an old guy, so watch that.
Well, this guy was older than us. And I was talking to him. We were on a cruise, and he was kind of giving me kind of some of the wisdom that he'd seen over the years. But he said, the real issue is that a lot of the problems, if you were to go back and ask, he said, my father, and you were to ask him, well, why do we need allies? He would say, are you out of your mind? If you were to ask him, why do we need a measles vaccine? He'd say, do you know what happened with the measles? We've gotten to the point on a lot of things, we've forgotten the value of it. Deterrence is one of them, right? Deterrence, we spend somewhere around $850 billion a year on defense. You could actually break that up. You can start taking a look at like what percentage of that is because of Russia and what's going on in Europe, what percentage of that is China, what percentage of that is the Middle East, and then what percent is spent on terrorist activities and other things around the world. And it ends up being, your biggest chunk is China, your next biggest chunk is Russia, then comes Iran, and then the small portion, 15% or so, is based upon the idea of fighting terrorism. But here's what's interesting. Why are we really spending all that money? Deterrence. It's the idea that we know that the other sides would take action if they didn't think we would respond. In fact, if you really want to know why we didn't have a nuclear war, we almost did. Why didn't we launch? Because we thought the other side would launch back. Why didn't the other side launch? Because they thought we would launch back. It's only deterrence that has saved us. Now, if you were to move away from the nuclear war and you said, no, we're just going to go back to another world war because we lack deterrence, believe me, that's a lot more expensive, not just in terms of money, but in human lives.
Absolutely.
And so, again, what we're trying to build this case of in the book is don't throw out the baby with the bathwater. There's a lot of good things that we have here. That doesn't mean that we don't think that we have things that we need to fix. I think both of us agreed one of the things that we need to fix is the extremism on both the right and the left, and that they both tend to have a very negative, pessimistic view over who we are, and they'd like to change the core fundamentals of who we are.
Yeah, and I think it might be a good time to mention. I think a lot of what I like about President Trump is he doesn't accept the current wisdom as the gospel.
Mm-hmm.
And some of those changes, I mean, I do think some of the changes coming out of HHS on vaccines are, in violation of all good science. So that may be, I'm not going to accept the current wisdom, but some of those things are a little nonsensical. But putting pressure on them, raising the question, why is it that America spends so much on the military in Europe when Europe doesn't spend enough on itself? Mm-hmm. That's a really good question, and he's gotten some pretty good answers.
And results.
And pretty good results. Mm-hmm. And he's doing the same thing Japan and Korea, mm-hmm. and demanding that they pay more of the share that protects them in that part of the world than America does. Those are good questions. When it gets to a place where everybody else is just crazy and stupid, and so everything is bad, that's clearly not true. That's where it becomes a little bit of a challenging, as he's saying we're just putting pressure on. No, we're actually not recognizing some of this is true.
Help me understand this from a legal standpoint. So tariffs were originally in the Constitution.
I was going to ask you. I'm just going to ask you about tariffs because I think it's a good thing to talk about.
And the original authority to be able to issue tariffs was granted to Congress. Yet the president, one man, is being able to do this in wholesale ways. First, how did that happen? What changed? Is he just violating the law, or was there law that was written during that period of time? And the second part of it is, do you think that the founders were right, at least on tariffs, to put the power into Congress as opposed to the executive?
Well, I think the founders put all bills in Congress, including revenue, in the House of Representatives. And so tariffs are revenue, tariffs are taxes, depending on how you look at it. So I think we're in a very challenged time. An interesting book out there called American Covenant by Yuval Levin, who's talking about Congress is not stepping up to the plate and doing their job. And I think many people feel that. So I think a lot of what has happened and the power that has been somewhat delegated by both parties to both presidents of both parties has been basically, I would say, a lack of courage, because they can't figure out how to have the compromise to make that happen. So there are many powers listed in the Constitution. So, for example, only Congress can declare war. And the Congress could not say, in my opinion, we decided we don't want to declare anymore. We're going to pass a bill that says the president can declare war. They can't do that. That would be unconstitutional. So the president has grabbed a lot of that power over the years by Congress basically not defending itself, and in part by the president never declaring war, by saying, just as even President Putin says in Ukraine, it's just a special military action. So our presidents haven't really declared war. They've just said, I'm the commander in chief, I'm defending America. But they have declared war, and Congress hasn't seized the power back. And so there's lots of those things where Congress has felt they need to create other solutions to what is really their problem to solve. So the creation of independent agencies. That, in effect, taking the power of Congress and arguably the power of the president and putting it into an independent agency, which is not in the Constitution. And there's some pretty good arguments to say that wholesale movement of power from Congress and from the president to an independent agency is flawed. And it's being challenged by President Trump in many areas, and will continue to be challenged. I think the Supreme Court is in an interesting spot. I mean, right now they're deer in the headlights. They're so busy they can't see straight. But they were on a journey to try to recapture the Republican system that we have in America. When I say Republican, it's not Republican Democrat. It's that we have a federal government, we have a state government, state governments, and we have the people. And it starts with the people. All the power of the people is the most important power. The people delegate certain powers to the states, and the states delegate certain powers to the federal government. And the federal government under the U.S. Constitution is a limited government. And in the Bill of Rights, the 9th and 10th Amendments of in the Constitution, as part of the Bill of Rights, basically declare that any powers not specified in the Constitution are powers that are either exercised by the states or ultimately by the people. So we've kind of forgotten that framework, and there's a sense the federal government is this big Megillah with all this responsibility. No, it is a limited federal government. I think from the time of FDR, where the country was in such amazing challenges under the Great Depression, that so much of that power was just taken by the president back then and never reclaimed by Congress. And so the tariffs, I think the president, when he goes out and does tariffs, he declares a national emergency, because what they've given him is power to declare a national emergency. It's not clear that what he's declaring is a national emergency, and that is being challenged in courts. But then it's really not clear that he has the power to impose tariffs to address the national emergency. So that's too off wrong, in my view. He what we're talking about is not a national. We were just saying how strong our economy is.
Does this cut both ways, though? What I find is that we all want to jump into our tribe. We either want to say, the president shouldn't have that power because we're an anti-Trumper, or the president should have that power because we're a pro-Trumper. But where it cuts both ways, it seems to me, is Democrats over the years have wanted on the environment to give the executive branch more power, vast powers into the federal government. And on tariffs, we all now kind of see, and we have one guy out there who is kind of able to make a proclamation overnight, and the stock market goes up, and then change it. It goes back down, and then it goes back up, then it goes back down. And, a lot of people say, well, that's just Wall Street. What about Main Street? I don't know. A lot of Main Street have 401ks, right? I don't see there as being a difference between Main Street and Wall Street. I think that's a ridiculous assumption. But the point is that if you think that the president should have the authority to do that, isn't there some linkage to, well, then maybe he should have the authority to do what he's doing on the environment? And on the other hand, if you think that he shouldn't have that authority, well, then maybe you think he shouldn't have that authority on the environmental issues. And I'm wondering, as a matter of law and with the Supreme Court, is there any connection between those types of concepts?
I think so. Again, they are in the buzzsaw, and it's hard to see what direction they're going. But I think they were trying to get back to this notion of our democracy and our Republican form of government. By the way, there aren't very many Republican form of governments. There's plenty of democracies, but very few have a republic like we do, especially with two houses of Congress and the powers separated the way we have. But if you look at the stats, the countries that do, Germany is one. That's not they don't have a standard parliamentary system, and there are a number of other European countries that have that. They are often the most successful countries in many ways, and others have a parliamentary system, which really is kind of a mishmash between, kind of Congress and the executive are kind of in one bucket. And that isn't what our founders thought was important. So I'll turn that back to you, Paul, from your perspective. And maybe from our book's perspective, where would you, how do you? I agree with you that Democrats will fight like crazy when a Republican president is doing it, and then when a Democratic president isn't, they want to do that. They want the powers to be seized that way. How would you push back on the Democratic side to say, you did this under President Obama, under President Biden, under President Clinton? How would you communicate that back? What is being lost when you do that?
I think one of the best things that President Trump is doing for our country is he is making us rethink our values. He's making us think about very, very complex subjects, and whether or not this whole idea of what's good for the goose is good for the gander. There's so much hypocrisy at play. There's just so much hypocrisy. And Trump, I think he has like an instinct to catch those. He really does. Now, there are things I don't like about President Trump. I don't like what he's doing on tariffs, certainly. I don't like the fact that he creates this massive instability. I don't like that he's attacking our allies. None of those things make a lot of sense to me. And I'm not completely sure that he's committed to the American world order. But saying that, I'm also not sure he's not. No, I'm not certain that he's not playing a game with his America First group every bit as much as he's playing a game with our side.
And I'm pretty sure the vast majority of Republicans, whether they're governors or representatives or senators, believe in the American system. Mm-hmm. They're not here to blow up and create an autocracy.
Absolutely.
That is not what they believe. They just, they want to push on the areas that they view as important.
So what I find interesting, just like this budget debate that we're having, there's this huge void. And the void is this. We have the Republicans who are talking about we need to have these big cuts in taxes, and we're not really going to cut the social programs all that much because we don't want to do that. So they're creating a big, huge budget deficit. And also they're adding things on top. And the Democrats' only complaint is, well, you're cutting Medicare. Right? That's their only complaint. Well, you're cutting these social programs. The void is anybody looking at the deficits that you're creating? Is anybody looking at the problem? Of course, there are a whole bunch of people saying it. It's just only a couple in Congress. I mean, literally only 3 or 4 people that we could point to. What I believe is taking place is I think the American public is more focused on the budget deficit today than they have been in my lifetime. I'm hearing a lot of people talk about this, and I think that they're missing it.
Well, and they're seeing it, I think, as we talked earlier, they're seeing it in their pocketbook. Mm-hmm. And so they're now seeing there's a reason inflation is up. There's a reason interest rates are up. Oh, could it be the deficit? Yeah, it could be. I think if you ask the average Joe, did they care about tariffs? The answer was no, right until their 401ks took a hit. Exactly.
And then they were recognizing, I don't know, this affects me. So here's the point that I guess I would make, and I don't know if you agree with this. There will be really good things that come out of this era. There'll be we're going to take some knocks to the head, but there will be some really good things. We're rethinking who we are. And in that rethinking, people are going to need to figure out whether or not they think defending the old order was worthwhile. And I think there are many things in the old order that were worthwhile. But most importantly, I have an incredible amount of optimism because I think our founders gave us some flexibility. It can change and it can change back. I do not buy into we're going to become an authoritarian state. I must admit, every now and then I get a little nervous about things that I'm hearing and reading. But then I watch the Supreme Court, people that he appointed, and I'm going, they're not going to let this happen. This is not where they're really going. And you know, I listen to people in Congress. They may be afraid to speak up to him, but oftentimes they're doing things that are not in agreement with him. My point is, I think the founders thought this through. I have an incredible amount of optimism for who we are. We have a massive amount of resources. That doesn't mean that we don't have problems. I don't think being an optimist means that you ignore the problems. I think that pessimists tell us what the problems are, and then optimists should be the people who say, yeah, that's a problem. I'm optimistic enough to believe we can fix it.
Exactly.
Not that we can ignore it, right?
It's impossible to solve big problems with pessimism and fear. Mm-hmm. If you're fearful and in the crouch, you are not going to. All you're going to be is trying to lash out, not try to solve the problem. I think we approach this from the position that, okay, optimism is about being realistic. Yeah, these are some challenges, but you know, what do we have in America? We have the checks and balances in our system. We have the rule of law, which we call the scaffolding of democracy. You know, other countries would just die for the history that we have in the rule of law. We have independent lawyers. You know, they've been under attack from the White House, but many of them are stepping up and filing lawsuits and challenging the issue. We have an independent press. I'm you know, former newspaper person myself, and we were very successful in the 90s. It's not the same today, but there's still an independent press. And frankly, the social media is providing an independent democratization of media that gets more information out. And you know, there are other factors that we have. So I do, you know, back to you know, that this is not just a Republican issue; it's a Republican and Democratic issue. I talked to my spouse Wendy the other night about, she's a hardcore Democrat. Times I think she's maybe she might be a communist.
Yeah, be careful, Larry. We're live.
She's
Your wife
pretty
might be watching.
She's pretty hardcore. And I said, when, you know, we were talking about the deficit, and she, you know, that's not something she would ever talk about. And I said, you know, when you're ever looking to somebody for leadership, when you're listening to a Democrat, or you ever have an opportunity to talk to somebody you know is Democratic, ask, what would they do? Because right now the answer for most Democrats is, don't cut those social programs, tax the rich. It isn't about a shared responsibility, shared pain.
Yep.
Let's raise all revenues, which includes all of us maybe getting a little more in spend, and let's figure a way to spend less, and then let's have a collective discussion. You're not going to get 100%, but maybe you get 70% or 80% of America around an important issue that we can solve and maybe spend more money on. And so I'd love to hear a leading Democrat saying, okay, yeah, I don't think we should throw poor people off of Medicaid. Well, you know, the truth is, as the criticism from Democrats is, they're cutting Medicaid for women and children. That is just such baloney. They are not. What they are cutting is the Medicaid expansion, which put a lot of younger people, often a lot of young single people, often a lot of young people who could work, onto an expanded Medicaid. And they're trying to carve that back. Now, those people need health care. So you need that solution. But I would love to hear, especially on the other side, say, what would you do to reduce our spend? Because it is 90% a spending problem. Revenues have continued to go up and will continue to go up even with the tax cuts, extension of the tax cuts. Revenue has continued to go up pretty dramatically. It's what's one of the great things of what's right with America. We are flourishing with our revenue, but expenses have gone up much more rapidly. So it's an expense problem. If you did that in your home budget, you'd say, I can't spend all that money. I've got to make some hard choices. Maybe one of the hard choices is we do spend less in foreign aid. It's tragic to not spend and help people that are starving. But there are some things we have to carve back. We can't do everything.
There's no end to good programs.
There's no end.
They just don't end. And that doesn't mean that there aren't things that we should be doing. But even if we made the cutbacks, we're still going to be doing an awful lot, an amazing amount. But let's talk about. Let's end this with this concept. So why did we write the book? I'm going to give my why, and then I'll let you end it. This whole subject that you're talking about, to me, is about finding agency. It's the idea that that it's very profitable and it's very helpful for politicians or news medias or other groups to scare you, to terrify you. Because if they terrify you, you tend to look to them for comfort. You tend to look to them to fix your problems. The reality, most of these problems are ours. They're man-made, so they can be solved by men and women. Right? There is a role that we can play. The key is that you have to first have maybe it's a reminder, or maybe it's an understanding of who we are and how we got here. The beginning portion of the book spends time talking about the founders because we want people to understand they had a logic to what they were doing. We then spend time on the philosophers so that you can go one step deeper if you would like to really understand what it was that the philosophers were trying to get to, how they were trying to get to this concept of the individual. We then spend some time talking about the two extremes and what their philosophical points of view are, both the far right and the far left. And I'm not including Donald Trump in the far right. I'm talking about the Proud Boys and the Oath Keepers and the people who are on that extreme edge. And on the other side, it's the folks who have a view that everything that's happening in this country is wrong. That's kind of, let's call it the woke society today. I don't even know if that's the right word, but there's an extreme left that counters that extreme right. And then what we try to do is to talk about modern day issues and how that affects them. Well, if you look at issues like the budget, it's a problem, no doubt about it. I'll tell you how it gets fixed. Podcasts, that seems crazy, but a lot of you're not in Congress. I'm not in Congress. The people watching, they're not in Congress. But when you watch a podcast and you listen and you're influenced by it, all of a sudden you become somebody that when you're polled or when somebody asks you a question, it begins to have an effect on how you see things. So there's still a huge amount of control by the private sector and by individuals to be able to talk about the things that they see as being important. As you said, our media has become more democratized. But the fundamental key to recognize is we can fix these problems. We have huge amounts of resources. All the data says to us there's nothing like the United States. So instead of taking the view we can't fix this, let's take the view that we're doing an awful lot here that is amazing in the United States, and it's unsurpassed any time in world history. And at the same time, recognize we're not going to be able to fix every problem, but we can fix some of them. And maybe some of them are going to be fixed by government, but increasingly we're seeing more of them being fixed by the private sector. In fact, I would argue the cure for cancer, extending human life, getting to Mars, creating a driverless car that saves lives on the free. Those are all going to be private sector answers. And they're big, huge problems that are being addressed. There's nothing like this place. And you need that optimism to have agency. And we all need agency to be able to recognize that what we have here not only is something spectacular, but that we still can have an effect on changing it.
Yeah, that's well said. And I think your focus on agency, I would never have articulated that before we started the book. But I think, what you have pushed on there and how clearly you've articulated it is so important. I've, recently been reading several books about Mormonism, and Arizona's a strong Mormon state. So any Mormons watching this, if I get this wrong, please forgive me. But I think one of the key factors for Mormons is the notion of agency, as a strong belief in individual choice. Now, within the framework of the Mormon religion, you believe what we believe, but they do really recognize agency, and they recognize agency of others outside their religion. So Mormons are normally hardworking with other groups that they would never in their religion believe in that belief, but they respect the rights of those people to do that. And I think we need more groups that recognize the rights of others to do that. I think I came to the book mostly because you've been on this journey with the Optimistic American for pretty long now, all things considered, and really pushing that, oh my God, would we stop looking in the mirror and feeling sorry for ourselves? That there is so much to be gained by us basically recognizing the power which we all have. And the podcast has articulated that over and over in many interviews and many discussions. And I think I brought to the book the notion that I love being a lawyer, and all my friends would say, yeah, you do, and I hate you when you do that. But the notion of the rule of law, the notion that this is pretty important in America, and then to have had the opportunity to be in the newspaper business. So the freedom of press is in the First Amendment. It's one of the few businesses in the Constitution called out specifically. So I take the law and I take the press and I bring them together and say, and with the agency discussions, and say, we have a foundation in America that lets us solve these problems. Let's kind of get up, let's dust ourselves off and get to solve these problems. So I think for me, it was like, let's remind everybody how good they have it, and let's help each other get stronger and better. And let's win the 21st and the 22nd and future centuries.
Yeah, lawyers take a lot of flack, and I give it to them every now and then. But I will just say this. Over and again, they stepped up when we've needed them to. I look at the civil rights movement. It was a bunch of young lawyers that went down into the South that really turned the tide. They filed cases. They made certain that people's rights were being taken care of, and then they lost. In some cases, they lost their case. In some cases, they lost their lives fighting for those things that they believed in. My guess is that for those people who are worried about losing the rule of law, and those people who are worried about losing our democracy, that's exactly the group that we're going to be turning to make certain that we don't.
Absolutely.
So, Larry, thank you.
Thank you.
Before we finish, we did get a YouTube comment from our very own Nick Wilshire, and you had talked about the founding fathers earlier. And so I would maybe just like to have your guys' insight on, do you think the founding fathers would be satisfied with how the government has grown and changed? What would their opinion be of America now?
I'll give my opinion first so you can think about it, and then you give the last comment on it. So there wouldn't be one opinion. There were a number of people who were our founders who they wanted to keep government extremely small. I think there are others who would have looked at it and said, oh my gosh, look at how we've accommodated technology, people, population growth, a whole series of things in a magnificent way. My guess is, I'm not sure how that, this is just a guess, knowing the personalities. I'm not sure Thomas Jefferson would have liked how much it grew. Although, he was all for limited government right until he decided to purchase Louisiana, right? The Louisiana Purchase. And then he thought, well, okay, we need to be able to expand.
Probably artwork in the White House.
To grow. My bet is Hamilton would love it. My bet is Hamilton would look at this and say, look at the financial infrastructure. Look at what we've been able to create. Look at what technology and jobs have done. Look at how we overcame big problems like slavery. But again, I don't think there would be one opinion of it. I think the better question, though, to ask is this. Well, so let's go back to that day and say, would we have been better if we had a third of the population? I mean, because that just means 2 and 3 people that wouldn't be here, right? And maybe you wouldn't be here. Recognizing that you're not going to do something that draconian, that you're going to have growth, you have to find a way to accommodate people. And I'm amazed by how they created a document that's been elastic enough that it's been able to solve the problems over time. And even as I'm watching what I see as being threats to our current democracy, I have incredible faith with it because I'm watching the system that they put into place and then the people who are implementing it. It's not perfect, but they're still doing their job.
I would think that the founders, they'd be stunned at the success of America. I think they would look here and go, we had some optimism here, but holy cow, have you exceeded any, of course, in the 18th century, you couldn't have seen what we see today, even remotely, but the notion that the economy could grow so strong, the notion that freedoms could be so extended to so many other people, back in the founding era, it was white landowning men that had all the power, and some of the founders kind of expected that's the way it was going to be. We've changed that through amendment. We've expanded the rights to vote to women, the right to vote to all minorities in America. We've been a welcoming country to immigrants. It's lately been challenged, but over time, if we look at the slope, America grows in major part because people want to be in America, to raise their family, practice their faith, and have a job, and hopefully grow a business. So I think they'd be stunned by the success of America. I think they would be quite disappointed by what appears to be the loss of power or the unwillingness to stand and defend the rights of Congress. I think they would step up today and say, folks, get your act together. You have all the powers. You are Article 1 for a reason. Stop doing this. Stop. I don't think they would be disappointed with the president. They kind of expected a president would do what any president is now doing if Congress was basically defanged.
Put on the limits.
And they would be very proud of the judiciary, because the judiciary kind of evolves, a little bit from the founding moment. So they would look at 2 of the 3 branches and they'd be delighted with the judiciary. They would not be surprised by an executive exerting so much power. And I think they'd be disappointed on Congress. Yet despite that, we continue to have all these powers and rights and successes. So we can't beat up Congress too much, because we have continued to grow. And it isn't despite Congress. They've passed some laws that have been very good. They've cleaned up our air and our water, and you go down the list of many things. So I think they'd be disappointed in Congress today, and it doesn't mean it won't be fixed tomorrow.
Yep. All right. I think that's all we have. We appreciate it. Thanks again for joining us. And we appreciate not only your support and being a part of the New Frontiers Optimistic American program, but if you like what we talked about today, take a look at buying that book. All of our proceeds right now are just going back to this cause, but the book is What's Right with America. Thanks again.
Thank you.